In my line of work, I've had the opportunity to meet so many people. In the last few years, I've met some of these people while they're incarcerated. And when I visit them in conversation, I often ask the question, if there was one thing that you could change about what led you to prison, what would that be? And while the answers typically might vary from one person to the other, one thing that is very common is that for the most part, they say they wish they could change that particular moment in life in which they pulled the trigger. So imagine if that was possible. Imagine if one could help identify individuals who are at the highest risk of gun involvement and to be more likely victims of violence or even perpetrators of violence. And imagine being able to intervene and interrupt an instinctual reaction. I've been able to witness that firsthand. READI Chicago is an innovative response to gun violence in our city. We provide subsidized employment, support services, and cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT, to the highest risk individuals in our city. Earlier this year, I met a young man by the name of Devin, a resident of North Lawndale, one of the sites that we currently are working in. Devin, about 6'1", 6'2", lengthy, tall individual. His simple smile would disarm you. And in fact, even rival gang members who would meet him couldn't help but take a liking of him. Devin, like most of our participants in our program, and like most people who come from inner city neighborhoods that we work in, have a number of challenges and struggles, from exposure trauma to domestic violence, and even, unfortunately, interactions with the criminal justice system. Devin, on a Tuesday morning, him and his staff were sending me pictures as he was at a Chicago Bears training camp. And him and other participants were smiling, and you could tell for the first time they were experiencing something that, unfortunately, they never experienced in their lives. And so the next day, on Wednesday, he was still kind of really at awe at the fact that he was just around a whole bunch of Chicago Bear players. Around 5 o'clock came, our participants were released from our program. Devin and 2 other participants were walking back to their homes, and this particular day they decided to take a different alternative route. And in doing so, a young man ran right behind them, shot multiple times, causing Devin to fall, and only later, just a few hours later, being pronounced dead. And I can't help but to wonder that what if the young man who shot Devin would have had the tools to help him create a pause, a wedge between his actions and his impulse? And what would have been if this young man would have had support systems and people to actually listen to his grievances and to help him process and heal? Perhaps Devin would still be here today, and this young man would not be in the run. And tragically, Devin is just one of 10 participants so far this year that unfortunately we've lost in our program. And he's one of 300 plus residents of our city who've also have passed away in our community. This particular issue is really close to heart for me. I, at a very young age, experienced domestic violence at home. And by the time I was 13, I witnessed someone shot and killed just a few yards away from me. By the time I was 17, a friend of mine actually died in my car as he was stabbed. And by the time I was 18, I was in front of a judge being sentenced to 29 years in prison. I've been home already 11 years. And within those 11 years, I've dedicated my life to think about what is the best way that we could address violence in our community. The issue is extremely complex, and there is no one cookie-cutter solution to this. But one thing that I found to be very helpful along the way is addressing individuals' trauma. One of the ways that we do that through READI is through CBT, cognitive behavior therapy. And cognitive behavior therapy is designed to really create a wedge between action and impulse. An opportunity for individuals to reflect and challenge the way that they perceive themselves and the way they typically mitigate their conflicts. It's challenging beliefs, it's challenging thinking patterns, but it's also doing it with a group of individuals that share very similar experiences. In fact, the science tells us that with 200 hours of CBT, we could begin seeing change in people's lives and in some of those behaviors. We can't simply just tell people to put their guns down or to stop acting a certain way. We need something tangible, something to exchange that. And whether it's jobs, or whether it's housing, or whether it's legal services, there has to be opportunities for us to be able to give something more concrete and more tangible for individuals who are more likely to be victims of violence and offenders of violence. The other thing is access is not equitable. For example, in Chicago, in the Gold Coast, a very prominent affluent community, we have over 360 clinicians per 1,000. Where in comparison, in the west side of Chicago, a community that is highly concentrated with violence has a 0.1 clinician per 1,000. One would have the impression that in the Gold Coast, there perhaps are more challenges and people are being exposed to more trauma than in the west side of Chicago. And that's not necessarily the case. The west side of Chicago is one of the hardest communities, particularly Austin and North Lawndale, West Garfield, that are impacted by this issue of violence. So at the end of the day is how do we provide more access to the men and women in our city? While cognitive behavior therapy is the intervention of READI Chicago, at the end of the day, we provide employment opportunities for our men. Jobs do make a difference, and unlike what people might think, the folks that come from our communities do want employment, but sometimes don't have the technical or soft skills that often many of us in this room perhaps take for granted. And so it's important that in many cases, the reason why that happens is because the exposure to trauma. How can we expect someone to function like the average person in our city when individuals like in READI have experienced about 87% of the participants in our program witnessing or having a loved one lost to violence. And 60% of the individuals have done prison time. At the end of the day, if we expect to heal as a community, we have to address our trauma. In fact, in our country, we have over 48,000 policies and laws that as a result of collateral consequences create barriers for people to receive housing or certain license or certain levels of education. And most of the time, we're talking about black and brown individuals. READI Chicago is showing the CBT is working. We're seeing it through the way they're engaging individuals, the way they're engaging their peers, when they get pulled over through a traffic violation. I didn't say our men are being angels now. But they're exercising what they're learning. They're bringing it home. They're sharing it with their peers. And there's so many stories, so many vignettes that I could share around that. So we see the impact that it's having in an individual, in their families, and in their lives. And I would simply want to point out that to work with this population, we really have to understand what are those barriers that these men and women are facing. And I think it's imperative for me to mention as a closing that it is important for us to think about how we collaborate with others. It's important for us to how do we use the best research, the metrics, the data to really inform the work that we're doing. It's important for us to challenge policies. And so I encourage you and the viewers to think about reaching out to your elected officials to challenge current policies. The state of Illinois actually has about 1,500 policies that make it challenging for our men and women. 1,500. We need government to really invest in this population in a way that makes the most sense. We need companies to take a chance and to engage returning citizens, to engage those who've been part and who have been harmed by the criminal justice system. We need communities to find space for our individuals to heal. As I leave, I want to make sure that I'm able to highlight one of our participants who's been with us for about almost 17, 18 months already. This young man who's faced, again, similar challenges like Devon has. Before, and I quote this, his mom used to tell him as this young man would walk out of his house to be careful out there, to be careful out in the streets. And today when this young man wakes up in the morning to head out to work, his mom smiles at him and tells him, have a good day. READI is healing people, families, and communities. That is the power of CBT, and that is the power of access and opportunity. Thank you.